Good morning. It's an advantage to be the third speaker of our panel, and I will try to take advantage of this. Mr. Nielman is one of our customers in the Aeroporto Regional Zona da Mata, an airport which was closed down for many years, and which the government of the state of Minas Gerais decided to activate. So they made a tender, and we won the public tender to operate the airport. We're operating the airport, and Azul is I believe, the only customer so far, but 3 flights a day, is that right? 3 flights a day. The other day when we were discussing the port of the future with the chief of the civil cabinet of President Dilma, and Mr. Bernardo Figueiredo and Dr. Jorge Gerdau, the question keeps coming up, what is the port of the future? And I can tell you, the airport of Juiz de Fora is an example of the airport of the future. The airport is working very smoothly, I believe, and I told Minister Gleisi Rousseff, now in the position of the ex-president Dilma Rousseff, that she should land there as a common passenger, not as a minister. And then she will see the quality that we are able to deliver after the concession of the airport in Juiz de Fora. But our presentation today here is focusing on ports. And I would like to start my story with this picture, because I think this summarizes the success of port privatization in Brazil. Happy customers. This is the chairman of the executive board of Hamburg Süd, our largest client at Santos, Brazil, during the christening ceremony of one of his super post-Panamax vessels, 7,000 TEU, in Santos last month in July, at which time we learned from his directors. He thanked us for the excellent partnership with the company, and we learned from his directors that the productivity and the service of Santos, Brazil is absolutely up to par to the European ports that the same vessels call. This is no surprise to us, but it is a surprise to most of you because we have not been successful in voicing the progress and publicizing the progress of the Brazilian ports and the incredible contribution of the Brazilian modernized ports, especially the public ports now run by private enterprise, to the Brazilian economy. I learned during the IPO of Santos Brazil that economic openness is the key word in ascertaining the health and strength of an economy. And as you can see, after port privatization in 1997, foreign trade exploded. It grew from 1990 until 2011, 11 times, while the GDP only grew 5 times. Economic openness now is 20%, almost double of the 12% before port privatization. And foreign trade amounts to almost $500 billion compared to $100 billion. There's a lot of talk about congestion and lack of capacity in the ports. In Brazil, we hear about the apagão portuário. But in fact, what we are experiencing is the opposite. We're experiencing an acesão portuário. And the proof of the pudding is the result. In 2010, Brazil, after the crisis, experienced a spectacular growth in its foreign trade, bigger than China's. A country that grows 32% in exports and 43% in imports one year, and then 27% in exports and 24% in imports the next year must have a port system that works. Otherwise, it couldn't achieve this tremendous growth in trade. Some people say, well, this is only commodity prices. Richard, you and your statistics, I'm an economist, a frustrated economist that got into the transport business because I couldn't find a job as an economist. But I like statistics and I like to show the correlation of things. Here we see, on the right-hand side, the international trade flow growth in dollars, $billion, and on the left-hand side, the direct correlation to the number of containers handled. Now, containers carry, of course, the most precious cargo, the cargo where you have the greatest amount of value added to in the merchandise. I stumbled across, preparing for this presentation, a paper called, I forgot the name in a moment here, a paper by the American Society of Civil Engineers that demonstrated that the United States is very dependent on its ports. 72% in tonnage and 42% in value move through the water, through the ports. But we in Brazil, we are not very dependent. We are totally dependent because of our foreign trade. 94% moves in tonnage, moves through the ports, and the equivalent of 78% of value. The key factor to, of course, provide for port capacity in the future is investment. And the American Society of Civil Engineers is extremely concerned about what they call the investment gap of $15.8 billion. And they have been able to put this wonderful slide together. This presentation will be available, of course. I don't want to spend too much time. But they put this wonderful slide together saying that $16 billion lack of investment in American waterway port infrastructure will subtract $770 personal income from every American if it is not done. The number 30 is magic. The Brazilian investment need is estimated by the University of Santa Catarina, based on several public information, at $39 billion, which is about 39 billion reais, which is about $19 billion. And as you can see here on the right column, going forward, the vast majority of this investment is slated for private enterprise. The part of the government is relatively small. In the ports nowadays, the part of the government is basically the infrastructure, the marine channels, and of course the road access and rail access infrastructure. And the good news is the investors are buying. The investors like the infrastructure story. We have today 3 port operators listed in the São Paulo Stock Exchange. The company in which my family has a shareholding and of which I'm currently vice chairman did its IPO 5 years ago. I was responsible for visiting over 110 customers on a one-on-one, and it was probably the most interesting week of my life, understanding how the investors judge where they're going to put their money. As you all know, it's done by a 20 to 30-year-old kid that listens to you no more than 30 minutes, and in 30 minutes, next 30 minutes, he asks you about 10 questions. You take the elevator, you go down. By the time you get to the car that is waiting and you're rushing off to the next interview, you get a message on your BlackBerry that says he subscribed $20 billion. And you go to the next one. But the most interesting questions were raised during this IPO process, and very many of them we have actually converted into positive action at Santos Brazil and at Multi Terminais. We have fared relatively well. The prices are here. 2 companies above the Ibovespa stock exchange, and I believe the future will be even brighter. There's also been a very big interest in private equity, and there have been a lot of management, merger and acquisition transactions. We have Mr. Alpesi here from Ecovias. They have just bought a terminal in the port of Santos. So investors like the port story. We must be doing something right. And just focusing now on container terminals, which is my specialty, looking back here, we have already invested $4 billion in public ports in the container terminals. $4 billion. This investment is not like buying your house or building your warehouse. This is investment that is real money put into existing installations, generally rebuilding and buying equipment, which at the end of the concession contract goes back to the state. So it must be very, very well applied. You cannot make any mistakes. There can be no waste. There's got to be huge efficiency in administrating your concession. And as you can see here with some of these metrics, if you look at the last line, it's the line that amazes me most. In 1998, Brazil, the whole country, had 11 gantry cranes in operation. Gantry cranes are these very big cranes that load and discharge containers. 11 cranes for the country. We now have 13 at Santos Brazil. The 11 cranes we had are totally obsolete. They are all no longer there. And the productivity, of course, has risen tremendously. We have built additional container yard. The quay length has tripled, and there's still farther growth ahead by means of the $5 billion that is slated to be invested by the container terminals, by the public container terminals by 2016. And all we need is the authorization of Mr. Bernardo Figueiredo. And he told me yesterday the idea is that there should be a fast track for expansion of existing capacity. And that will be the cheapest and the most efficient way, I believe, to bring these investments to fruition and bring the additional capacity to market. Now, I'm pretty much closing my presentation, but I would like to tell you, we have a new factor, we have a new element in the air in the planning for the Brazilian economy and for Brazilian infrastructure. And it has been dubbed by this magazine as the Gerdau factor. Gerdau, as you all know, is Mr. Jorge Gerdau, the president of Gerdau Steel Mill. And I have talked to Mr. Gerdau over the years, maybe twice or 3 times a year, discussing how I feel we should improve the ports. And he's always very, very interested in these discussions. And Dr. Gerdau has, I believe he has convinced the President Dilma that competitiveness is just as important as fiscal balance, monetary policy, social policy. Competitiveness is the new Gerdau factor, and I'm convinced that we are on the way and we will improve our competitiveness even more. But we cannot forget that the world is changing very, very rapidly. Shipping is a millennial activity, but containerization is only 40 years old. And containerization has absolutely changed the world. I believe, and I always say this, the container is the turbine of globalization. And Ships are growing, and we now have ships being built at 18,000 TEU. And of course, mega ships demand superports. This one, by example, is Santos, Brazil, receiving Super Post-Panamax ship, COSCO Vietnam, 8,000 TEU. As you can see, 6 gantry cranes working the ship. That means that we will have a productivity of 6 times 25. We will have a potential productivity of 200 moves per hour. Our record so far is 180 moves per hour. Pre-privatization was 12 moves per hour per ship. We're now moving a record of 180 and an average of 82 moves per hour. Drury Maritime Research, which is the most prestigious consulting house in the world, showing here the various ownership and operating structures of ports in the global container industry. On the concession agreement, the third line down on the right-hand side, lists Santos, Brazil as an example. I believe they picked the successful examples as an example of the concession agreement, which is the landlord model, very common and prevalent in port concessions globally. We have a consolidated regulatory framework. I learn every day. Every time I have a doubt, I ask Dr. Massau, and he teaches me another lesson, and I learn something more about the regulatory framework. But I made this slide here just to give some of you who may not be familiar with the detail an overwork of our regulatory framework. It has clear rules for concession of new ports, which is a big concern nowadays. It provides for flexible ownership and operating structures, public ports operated by private operators, as I told you, and privately owned terminals. In the privately owned terminals, the predominant cargoes are the bulk commodities, as you know, containerized cargo or general cargo, and bulk. In shipping and in ports are 2 worlds, bulk and general cargo. The only thing is that they move through ports and they float. The ships float. All the rest is different. And in the privately owned terminals, in Brazil, as in everywhere else in the world, you have a lot of dry bulk, liquid bulk, and some neo-bulk, but generally bulk. Few shippers, few receivers. This is an example of the new ThyssenKrupp private terminal built outside of the 6 billion euro plant in my state of Rio de Janeiro. We are the port operators. Multiterminais has been chosen as the port operator in an international tender. We move 5 million tons of steel and 5 million tons of slabs per annum through this terminal. And this terminal is benchmark for the steel industry worldwide. We have reached the record of 28,000 tons steel slabs per day. This is the new port, Superporto Açu, of Mr. Ike Batista, which will be inaugurated, the largest port investment in Brazil, also in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Private terminal. And to close my presentation, I'll tell you that I hope to see you next year, because there is still significant upside potential for Brazil. We are a small country with small economic openness when compared to our Latin American peers and to the BRICS. And I firmly believe that Brazil will continue to grow in the international trade, and that our responsibility to provide adequate service through its ports and airports, of course, contributes to realizing this very important objective. Thank you all very much.